Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to start inserting the lever and the hammer and the trigger. In order to do that, we're going to have to use these pins. Now on this particular gun, these will all insert from the right to the left. Not all guns are going to be that way. So the way to tell the difference is, remember, there's a small end that's smooth and a large end, a flared end, that has these little machined grooves cut into it. In order to tell which direction a particular pin goes in, if you look on the receiver, you will see that there is machining, there's buckling on the metal from where that machined piece went into the metal. Those imperfections look like little stars, like the star shape that's right around there. It looks like the metal is buckling is from those machine cutouts on the pins. So the side that you see that on compared to the other side is nice and smooth. You don't see those. The side that you see that metal buckling is the side that is grabbing those machine knurls where it's flared. So the pin needs to be inserted from that side so that the last thing to enter the metal of the machine, or the receiver, is that machined end of the pin, and that's what actually holds everything in place. Go. Now when you insert this into the receiver, you want to insert it so that when you're done, it'll set on the receiver like this, of course. You want this cut out, the open end of that facing towards the back of the receiver, and you want this post facing in towards the middle of the receiver. Insert it into the top. You're just going to put it right through this slot here, insert it into the top of the receiver, and let it pull all the way through. And it will just hang there. Right now it's not engaging anything, it's just setting in there. On that plate, on this plate, there was a moon-shaped cutout machined into the bottom of it. That post needs to sit into that little moon-shaped cutout. So if you take the front of that plate and tip it forward with your hand, it will raise the bottom of that plate up far enough that you can slip that post underneath there, and then when you push the lever back up against the bottom of the receiver, that will cause this to reset and it'll grab like it should. Now what you want to do is, again, making sure that you are driving that from the correct direction, insert the pin to hold that in place. Now when you're doing this, there's 3 receiver pins. The skinny pin is for the trigger. Set that aside. The other 2 are the same basic diameter, however, there's a long one and a short one. The short one goes into the receiver for the lever. That's your lever pin. And that's because there's a machined recess on both sides of the receiver that make the receiver not as wide. So using the shorter pin, making absolutely certain you are inserting this from the correct direction. For mine, it'll be inserted from the right. Put the small end of the pin in first. Make sure everything's lined up. Put it in as far as it'll go. And then using the nylon portion of your hammer, tap that flush. You can put it beyond flush. Just don't tap it too far because you don't want to remount that hole. You want to tap it so that you have about an equal amount of the pin showing on both sides, which will be almost flush. Now for the trigger, keep that lever open so that it's out of the way. Insert the trigger into the receiver, and then line up the hole in the receiver and the hole in the trigger right there. Again, making sure that you have the proper pin going from the proper direction. Small side into the hole as far as it'll go, and then seat it with the nylon hammer. And if you need to go beyond that, use a punch. Just make absolutely certain you don't go too deep and remount that hole. And there's your trigger. Now, next thing we're going to replace is the hammer. The hammer is held in, of course, by the hammer pin going in through this hole. However, this cocking piece needs to go in first. Large side and a small side needs to go in so that the large side is up and that post is going into the hole where this screws in, goes into the other side, because that post engages the hammer spring. If you look into the receiver, you can see the hole it sets into right there. Again, putting it in so that the large side faces towards the top of the receiver. Just put it in so that it falls into that hole, just like that. And once you have that in, if you tip that up and look at the back of the receiver, you'll see that post sticking out there where this threads in. When you insert the hammer, you want to insert the hammer so that the bottom of the hammer is behind the trigger, between the trigger and that cocking piece. And you want this curved portion and that little hook on the bottom of the hammer to be underneath the long side of that cocking piece that you just put in there. Insert the hammer so that the tail of the hammer is up and faces towards the back of the gun, and making sure that this little hook is underneath that cocking piece. So insert it, get it inserted in there, tip the gun up on its side, and line the hole up. In order to get that hole lined up properly, you'll probably have to put the hammer into a cocked position like that, and then insert that pin, again making absolutely certain that you're using the correct pin and inserting it from the correct direction. Insert the small end into the receiver first so that the large end will engage the metal on the receiver as you seat it. Okay, insert it and then tap it so that it stays in place. But this is one of those things you want to put this in just far enough to stay in place, but don't fully seat it yet until you have a chance to get this assembled a little bit further and check your assembly. From here, the hammer shouldn't move unless you pull the trigger. With the trigger pulled, it should move freely. It should also cock. You can hear it click as it engages. Pull the trigger and it should move freely. There's a stop point here that if you let go of the trigger, it will stop right there. If you hold the trigger down, it will move further than that, but if it moves further than that, that cocking piece is going to slip out of position and you'll have to start that process over again. So don't let it slide, don't hold the trigger down so that it does not move forward of that stop position. In here and make sure that that post is basically centered in the hole there. Once you have that centered, take that piece, I still have the duct tape on mine, take the hammer spring, again with a little bit of silicone grease to make sure it stays in place, and insert it into the side that's threaded on the outside. One side's threaded on the outside, one's threaded on the inside. The side that's threaded on the outside is where the spring goes. You'll know because the spring will go all the way in. The other side it'll only go in about an inch or so. I leave a little bit of the spring as a tail sticking out and use that tail on the spring to engage the post on that cocking mechanism to make sure that it stays centered while I insert that and then screw that in. When you're doing this, do not tighten this down all the way until you've checked your assembly. Tighten it down basically finger tight right there, just until it stops. Now what that should give you is just a little bit of a spring action on that hammer, so if you pull the trigger, the hammer will fall. And again, it should cock, and then when you pull the trigger, it should spring. Keep your thumb there so that it doesn't go past that stop point. Just catch it with your thumb, then release the trigger, and then just make sure that it doesn't go past that stop point right there. Once you've ensured that all that is proper, you can go ahead and seat this pin the rest of the way. Once you've got that seated all the way, with whatever method you're using to protect that metal, go ahead and grab that with your pliers and tighten that the rest of the way down. Now, what I recommend before you're going any further is checking the assembly. Grab the receiver or the lever and cock it to make sure that it cocks the hammer. Then reset it. Flip it over, and that block right there is your loading block. When you cock the hammer, or when you cock the lever, that should also lift so that it'll place a bullet in the correct position, and then it'll lower when you reset the lever. If all that's functioning okay, you can go ahead and continue with your assembly. Alright, the last thing we're going to assemble here is the bolt. Remember that the bolt has this bar, this retention bar, and the firing pin that are both just kind of sitting in there free, and they will fall out, so make sure you're holding those in place while you manipulate the bolt. Also, when you look at the inside of the receiver, you'll see this plate. The curved portion of that plate matches the curved portion on that part of the bolt. To insert the bolt, start with the receiver and hammer in a cocked position. Take the bolt, insert it from the top, paying attention to make sure that that groove lines up there. Roll this over. When you roll this over, you will notice that retention bar does not line up. So just use a dental pick or toothpick or something and grab that retention bar and slide it until the holes line up. Once you've got those holes lined up, you can just insert those two screws. Screw them down just a couple of screws, a couple of turns, just to make sure that the threads are aligned properly and that everything's going to stay in place. Turn them down until they are almost flush, but not quite flush. Do the same thing with the screws on the other side. Turn them so they're almost flush, and then check your function on everything. If everything's good to go, one at a time, take those screws out, put some Loctite on them, and put them back in until they're flush to that point. I'll show you real quick why you don't want to tighten them down all the way. If you tighten them down all the way, and you don't have to put them in tight, you just have to put them in below flush, the lever won't move. Nothing moves. So you want those to just barely be flush with the receiver on both sides. And to make sure everything stays in place, Loctite them in that position. Alright, next thing we're going to do is we're going to replace the magazine tube. And remember, the magazine tube is what holds the foregrip in place, the forearm in place. Start it off to the side of the receiver like this and insert it at an angle into that ring in the front of the rifle. You're going to have to twist and wiggle that to get it in there. Just keep twisting and wiggling it, work at it for a while. It'll get in there. Just be careful so you don't bend things. Once you get it in there, make sure that that little moon piece is facing against the barrel like it should be. Take your forearm. The small end goes towards the front of the rifle. The back end with those two holes go towards the back of the receiver, and those two pins fit into those holes. With the tube up out of the way, insert the forearm onto the receiver and onto those pins, and then tip it in place so that it's flush against the barrel. Then take that tube magazine and insert it until that piece is flush against the wood, because that's what holds it in place. This drift pin will go in next to hold everything in place. Like everything else with this rifle, that pin is also flared and only goes in one way, so make sure you're putting it in from the proper direction. Insert it, get it started with your hammer, and then flush it up. Now you can take the brass insert with the follower going in first, insert it into that tube, and then that pin that we inserted is what locks it in place. Now you can take that band and insert it over the foregrip, over the forearm from the top of the receiver, or top of the barrel rather. Insert it as far as it'll go, and there should be a hole there that lines up, and the smallest of your 3 self-tapping wood screws goes in there, and then just screw that down. Just screw that down. Don't over tighten it because you don't want to strip out the hole. Now, last thing to do is replace the stock. Remember, that screw has a 4-sided head on it. If you don't have the proper size head on that, or the proper type head on that, it's just a regular slotted screwdriver will work. Put the stock on so that the raised comb is towards the top. Just insert it there and fully seat it. And using a long-handled screwdriver, just insert the screwdriver into the back to engage that screw, and then crank it on. Turn it until it's tight. Place your butt plate facing the correct direction, of course, and hold it on with those 2 self-tapping wood screws. Once you get those tightened down, again, tighten them down until they're flush and make contact, hold everything in place, but don't over tighten them because you don't want to strip out the wood. And there you have your completely reassembled Ithaca model M49R, the repeater version.